You will be able to find the webinar here under our products and publications. Go to webinars. And right now it's right here under the upcoming webinar section. It will move over to this section. And after the webinar has been recorded and posted to YouTube, the link will be on this webinar page down here at the bottom, and we'll also send around a link in an email once we're finished. So you'll be able to access this at that time. Some just logistics about GoToMeeting. All attendees are in listen-only mode, so we won't be able to hear you, but we do encourage questions. So there's two ways you can ask questions. There is a chat box. You'll see the question item in your dashboard. You can type questions into that chat box as we go along, and I will be monitoring them. This is Katie O'Connor with CBI. And you can also use the raise hand function. You'll see the little hand in your dashboard. If you raise your hand, I can unmute you and you can ask your question verbally. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Megan Dalton.
All right.
Go ahead, Megan.
Thank you, Katie. So my name is Megan Dalton. I'm the program manager for Pacific Northwest Climate Impacts Research Consortium, a NOAA RISA team. So this is the 5th webinar in our series that we've been doing on evaluation of decision support tools and resources. Today, Holly Hartmann will talk about decision support tools suitability, how to help decision makers to choose your tools. Holly is the Director of Climate Science Applications for Carpe Diem West. She's a leader in research related to the development of decision support tools for climate, water, and other resource management applications. Holly joined CERC in 2015 to help us develop and improve our decision support tools and resources. So this webinar series is targeted towards our CERC team members, but we welcome participation from the broader network of those providing climate services. So feel free to ask questions and engage in discussion at the end of Holly's presentation. So with that, Holly, go ahead.
Okay. I haven't seen the button for getting the screen to turn over, so there we go. Great. All right, thanks everybody for coming today. This is the 5th of the webinars that we've done looking at decision support tools and different evaluation frameworks for trying to improve how we both create and communicate about tools for decision makers and people who serve decision makers and stakeholders. I'm going to start off with just a brief description of decision support and talk a little bit about why I came to this particular aspect of looking at decision support tool assessment, and then we'll dive into the decision support tool suitability. We'll be looking at things like evaluation criteria, frames of access, thinking about any kind of restrictions on the use of tools that might affect whether someone chooses to use your tool over another, and then talk about next steps specifically related to CERC. So let's take a look. I want to review, I cover this every time, but I want to make sure everybody kind of understands where I'm coming from when I'm talking about decision support tools. I think of decision support tools and resources in a broad way. I go with the definition put out by the National Research Council report in 2009, the report on informing decisions in a changing climate, that says decision support includes efforts to produce and disseminate climate information, but it's also about facilitating the use of that data and information to actually affect the quality and efficacy of decisions. So it's not just about putting something out there, but connecting with what it is that decision makers are trying to do and the values that they have, and then helping develop that knowledge based on the information that the tools may be able to provide. And so it's a little more expansive kind of definition. In terms of looking at this notion of suitability, I came to this through my work with the Carpe Diem West network. It's a broad network of water resources practitioners from the local to federal level, including water utilities, state and federal agencies, NGOs, academics, and so on. And one of the key issues that we kept running into as practitioners were trying to evaluate risks, make use of the information that was out there, and find decision support tools, is that they were just simply overwhelmed by the number of tools that were out there. We had some cases where people were spending a huge chunk of time just searching out tools, looking at them for days, equivalent of weeks, and coming away more confused than ever. There are so many tools out there, and they take some effort to get to know what's involved with a given tool. And we found that many folks were hesitant to actually commit to a new tool because of the time it takes to learn a tool, and then the amount of trust you have to build in the stakeholders and other decision makers that you might work with. So it's not just a question of looking at tools, finding one that fits, but thinking about what's really required to really integrate that tool into your decision process, which involves people of a lot of different backgrounds, that you're managing relationships and trying to connect with their interests as well. So how does this connect with the CERC project? We have 3 driving research questions related to decision support tools. This webinar connects with our first and third questions about how can tools effectively facilitate the use of information and knowledge and help build adaptive capacity, not just for one decision maker at a time, but across scales and sectors, sustained over time, and then at a pace that's suitable with the challenges we deal with climate. And then how do we actually evaluate the decision support tools from the perspective of decision makers, from the perspective of the whole climate enterprise, and from the research community or academic community's perspective. So like Megan said, this is the 5th webinar. This is just a map of what we've covered so far. You can see that the framework from a user's perspective, we spent a lot of time there. We talked about the usability, that is one part of the usability of tools, and that was the communication effectiveness. We still have to cover the notion of the evaluation of the interface of any software tools in particular. That's a subject for a future webinar. We covered last webinar the notion of decision support tool utility, about how a tool actually fits into a decision framework and helps decision makers move along a decision process. And today's webinar focuses on suitability. That is, how would a decision maker choose your tool over all the tools that are out there? There's a lot for them to choose from, and how would they choose your specific tool? We've also talked some about technical sustainability, and then in future webinars we'll get to the academic and research perspectives. So here's this slide lays out kind of that difference between the different ways of looking at a decision support tool from a user's perspective. So for usability, they're just asking, can I operate and understand what this tool does and what it provides to me? We can see that that's important. If a person doesn't see that the outputs or the interface looks like it meshes with how they interpret information, people will say that tool is not meant for me, which will affect suitability, which is the thing we're going to be talking about today. And that is this the right tool for me? We're going to be looking at some criteria for evaluating suitability, and then looking at different frames of access that people might have when in searching for tools. And then we'll talk a little bit about some of the limitations that we may be placing on our tools and the ability of someone to actually decide that it's the right tool. And then we talked last time about the notion of utility, and once you've decided to use a tool, then figuring out how it is useful within your process. So there are a lot of tools out there, and I think all of you on a webinar realize that, and many others do too. And there's been some big efforts to try to create organized toolboxes or toolkits, that is, collections of information about tools to help decision makers and those who serve decision makers figure out what tools are most appropriate for their needs. I'm not going to go through and describe each one, but we'll see some examples of some of the, in particular, frames of access. And so maybe talk some about the evaluation criteria that some of these toolboxes have or don't have. But there are a lot. And for CERC, one of the questions is how much do we want to be consistent with the frames of access or the evaluation criteria of these toolboxes? So well, I guess I should say, I'll point out in a couple of these toolboxes, I don't know how familiar each of you are with these, but there's not necessarily clear criteria for how a tool gets accepted into any of these toolboxes. And in some cases, for example, the water toolbox, it's more based on establishing a partnership with the agency or group of agencies that runs the toolbox. And then once that partnership is established, then you can promote your tools within their toolbox. And it's not clear what the criteria are for allowing a tool to come in and into that toolbox, or when it's appropriate for a tool to actually leave the toolbox because the information behind it is out of date or has been replaced by a different tool. So for the Carpe Diem West Academy, which is the response we had to try to help our network with looking at tools, we adapted a framework put out by EPA, and it was funded by NSF and EPA. It's a long-lasting and well-funded. Well, it's done a lot of work. That is the Climate Literacy and Energy Awareness Network, the CLEAN network. They've evaluated a lot of tools, but specifically associated with education. That is through K through 16 education related to climate literacy and energy. It doesn't. Their criteria don't apply to tools. So we adapted their criteria for looking at decision support tools, and then of course one aspect of using decision support tools is providing training, and so their evaluation criteria map pretty well to looking at the training associated with tools. So I want to spend a little bit of time talking about what some of these criteria are. It turned out to be really helpful in our work with the Carpe Diem West Academy in looking at tools. We evaluated hundreds of tools, and then in subsequent projects for the National Park Service, we applied these criteria to tools for the Intermountain region, and it seemed to work pretty well too. So what kinds of criteria are related to the tools? We can see the major categories. The kinds of things that decision makers are asking is, what's the relevance of a tool? That is, what area does the tool address? Is this tool for me? Does it fit what I'm focused on? And what does the tool actually do? What kind of products does it produce? What's the legitimacy and credibility of the tool? That is, who developed it? Has it been updated recently? Who else uses this tool? Are there case studies of using this tool where it's been accepted by decision makers that look like me or do operate in the same arena as me? Has the tool been integrated into any standards of practice within an agency or other organization? Is this tool used in any kind of official training? Criteria related to usability include things like, is that interface intuitive? We've talked more about that in past webinars. I'm not going to go into that too much, but it is about, is the tool being updated? Are all the links still functional? Is there some sort of user manual or guide to using the tool? And then the last is looking at the connections and communication. That is, are there aids for understanding the tool, like video tutorials? Are there communities of users of the tool that can help each other in shared learning, or even in getting stakeholder or decision maker buy-in to actually using that tool? So if, for example, one water utility is using a tool, it makes it easier for another water utility to take on that tool as well. So having a community of whether it's a community of practice or some other kind of community just of users is an important criteria. And then just because a tool is out there and someone's going to use it, there's a need to actually do some training about how to use the tool. And training can be an important criteria in actually choosing a tool from others that are out there. If there's a training program for the tool, it makes it easier for an organization to take on that tool at scale across a number of different offices or a number of different regions. And training can also provide a level of legitimacy. For example, if an agency says that people from each region will go and take training that uses that tool, they've been given kind of approval to use that tool in practice compared to others. So it's helpful if your tool is integrated in some of these training programs for the types of decision makers and sectors that your tool addresses. But when it comes to training, then there's a whole set of criteria there as well that comes out of the CLEAN network. One is the scientific accuracy. So is it citing credible sources? Has it been reviewed by trained communicators or content experts? Does it reference the latest information, or is it referencing, for example, IPCC reports or national climate assessments from several iterations ago? Then there's criteria related to the effectiveness of the teaching. So has it been reviewed by teachers? For example, the COMET program based out of UCAR they develop tools or training with content experts, but then it's all developed by the education professionals so that their training is really good. So the third is thinking about the ease of use and the technical quality of the training itself and the website. And for some kinds of decision makers, it's an issue if that tool or the training associated with that tool takes you off site, and it has to be, if it goes off site, it has to be to other sites that have been approved. So there's some criteria related to the kinds of links that a training or a tool uses. So those are some of the criteria, but then it's not just about the how a tool stacks up. It's about how a decision maker actually finds your tool and decides that it fits their purpose. We talked in the last webinar about how a tool fits within this overall iterative risk management framework, where it fits about whether it helps to scope a problem, analyze a problem, prioritize and make a decision, or actually when you're implementing a project or a strategy, how you're monitoring it. But there are some other criteria as well, and that is thinking about frames of access, and that's who is the tool really for? What role in the decision-making process do they have? In the last webinar, we talked about sort of executive level, that is leadership of an organization, the field level managers, and then the sort of nuts and bolts of the technical support, that is the planners and engineers. But there are a couple of other criteria, or a couple of other groups that are important to consider as well, and that is the scientific and technical support staff within an organization, if they are there, if they exist, and then supporting those who do engagement and outreach. The report that I've listed down below is one that Greg Garfin and I and some others from the National Park Service put together for looking at training needs assessments for the Intermountain region of the Park Service. And I'll just highlight section 4 in that report describes how you, and it shows some examples about how you relate your tools to people at the playing different roles within the decision-making process, depending on their kind of what their job encompasses and what level of engagement they might have with the public or with the science community, where they fit within that whole decision-making process. And by considering these different roles, it makes it easier to say where your tool fits and how it moves the institution through its decision-making process as it's trying to hand off, whether it's something like an analysis result, to the folks that are going to be doing the prioritizing and decision-making. So there's other curation frames of access that when people are looking for tools, looking at the type of tool. There's some tools that are primarily data tools, that is, the analysis tools that produce maps or plots. There's information tools, which are things like the National Climate Assessment reports or other reports that are summaries. Some fact sheets fit in that class. And then there's guidance tools, which are checklists or memos from higher up within an organization that give approval to use certain kinds of tools or implement certain practices. And then there's the training type of tools, whether it's webinars or videos or formal classes, on-site or remote. And then I'm not going to go through all of these one by one, but I just want to point out that there are a number of different ways of looking at tools and what kinds of uses they have and what sectors they fit. On the far left, 1 through 7 are sort of the standard keywords that come out of the climate community, but there are keywords that, at least in the networks that I've been involved with and some of the others I've connected with, is that there's emerging keywords as people are moving from, as decision makers are moving from understanding climate to actually implementing adaptation projects, that there's other kinds of tools they're looking for. They're not necessarily climate tools, but they're related to dealing with the climate challenge. So you can see in the box in the left and the middle, sort of the more climate associated words, keywords, and then some of the other kinds of frames of reference that are coming up. It has to do with ecosystem services and avoided costs, how you finance and fund projects, and how do you communicate and engage with stakeholders, and then how organizations work together. And then over on the right are sort of these, just a list. Again, I'm not going to go through all of this in detail, but it's just an example for every sector, whether it's a water sector or an agriculture sector or coastal communities, that there's a number of subsectors that that people break themselves into, that a decision kind of connects with. And often tools fit one of those subsets, and they don't necessarily connect well with others. So helping decision makers know where specifically your tool fits with some of these subsectors is very helpful. Now, here are some of the other frameworks that are out there, or some of the other toolboxes and kind of the frames of reference that they have. And I've got 4 of them up here. One is the Climate Resilience Toolkit. One is the National Sea Grants Resilience Toolkit. One is the Water Toolbox, which is an interagency, federal level toolbox headed up by the Corps of Engineers. And then another is the CAKE, the Climate Adaptation Knowledge Exchange, that's run by EcoAdapt. You can see here, I'm not going to go through and read them all, but you can see how they break things out, and whether it's through, for example, the Climate Resilience Toolkit looks at vulnerabilities, data, communication, kind of, you see how they are looking at the function of the tool, and you can see the sectors or the sectors that they're looking at. And water, they use large categories, not necessarily the subcategories of groundwater, surface water, water quality, and so on. The Sea Grant folks use a different breakout. They make that distinction between guides and training, but they have a number of other categories as well. And then you can see what their sectors are in the rightmost of the white boxes there. So they've got a slightly different breakout. And then the water toolbox, you can see how they break things out. They've got policies and guidance and state water plans and some legislation, along with databases and some best practices. EcoAdapt uses the list there. You can see that they're more conservation focused or more environmental, conservation focused, rather than something like what maybe water utilities are dealing with. So every toolkit has their own set of frames of reference for helping people find tools. And the challenge for CERC is being able to connect with each of these toolbox. So whether you want to call it metadata or frames of reference, is in looking at your tools, is being able to identify where your tool fits for each of these toolboxes that you think your tool is relevant for, whether it's EcoAdapt or whether it's Sea Grant. And then the question is do we also want to have our own set of criteria that within CERC for thinking about where the tools fit, whether it's in the kind of function they have or what sector or topic they address. I just want to point out an example that I think is really a great one in looking at a number of different tools in terms of how they communicate where their tool fits and who the tool is for. And it's this Adaptation Workbook. It's a fairly new tool that's been developed by the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. It merges some work looking at adaptation tools for land managers and forest managers and agriculture, sort of like within our Climate Ag Toolbox. They've combined a couple of communities, but they do a really great job of describing their tools and making it clear who their tool is for and who it's not, and kind of what are some of the criteria, how they rank in some of these criteria that decision makers are looking at in trying to decide on whether to use a tool. So I'm just going to present that as an example of whether we want to in CERC maybe model this in how we communicate our tools, or adapt it somehow. There's one area though that I think that that any of the criteria that I've seen doesn't really address very well, and that is, so you're looking at a tool, you're able to say what your tool does, but we don't do such a good job necessarily of saying how this tool fits within the realm of all the other tools that are out there. What does your tool do that's different and an improvement over what other tools do? What's its unique value proposition? So the issue for me came up with in a project where people were having trouble understanding why Colorado River stream flow studies were putting out results that were so different. And there was a large cross-RISA project trying to figure that out. And it was very surprising to people about how different some of these approaches were. And this graphic that was put together by Julie Vano, you can get this, you can find a paper in the bulletin of the AMS that explains how it was all put together. But in working with stakeholders, this has been a really effective kind of representation about how different tools, or in this case models, relate to each other and why you would maybe want to choose one versus the other. I don't know, this is just an maybe whether CERC wants to do something like this, but I'd encourage the decision support tool projects, the teams, to think about whether they can represent their tool, whether you can represent your tool and how it relates to other tools that are similar to yours. Is it that their underlying databases are different and computed in a different way? Is it that they cover a region that's different? So you can see here for the Colorado flow, there's some tools or models that deal with global climate models at the top, or regional climate models, or that feed into hydrology models, or they route around hydrology models and just produce output directly. So coming up with a map, to me, I think of it as a genealogy of your tool. It's not just a list of references of the tool, but somehow a graphical representation that shows where your tool fits compared to the other tools that are out there. So those are some of we covered the criteria and the curation frames of access, how people sort of conceptually think about tools. The last thing I want to talk about is the kind of restrictions that maybe we put on the use of our tools without thinking about it. And I know within CERC, we've talked about this at length. I've covered this at one of our monthly meetings in a lot more detail, but I just want to include it in here. It's because it does fit within the suitability, evaluating the suitability. And that is, how is it that people can use the outputs of your tools in projects, especially if you're designing your tool not for an end user, but for an information intermediary like extension agents or consulting firms or other kind of technical support folks within organizations. And it's not so much of a problem when it comes to federal tools, but when it's private sector or NGO or university tools, we often see what you see here in the red circles. We see the copyright notices. And that's an immediate restriction on what consultants or others do or use when they're trying to connect with their own clients or constituents. It's one thing to say that you're using a tool to do education, but if you're actually using that tool to help make decisions, it's not education and covered under fair use, it's an actual use. And so we've had some discussion within CERC about whether we can put different kinds of notices on the tools that would cover things from fact sheets and checklists and handbooks and the software tools that make it clear that people have a particular kind of license to use the tool and its outputs in certain ways. And we've talked some about the Creative Commons licenses and the need to decide on which type of license might be appropriate for the CERC 2 tools. So I'm not going to go through each of the CERC tools, but I just wanted to focus on a case study, for example, for the Northwest Climate Toolbox in particular. And it's not to point out any kind of deficiency in the Northwest Climate Toolbox, but it's just to use them as an example in how we might think about some of these questions. I haven't gone through and tested or applied the evaluation criteria to the Northwest Climate Toolbox. I think it would be helpful to do that with the team, kind of after we've decided on sort of the collection of criteria that all the teams might want to use for the range of tools that we've got. But it would be good to use this to look at the toolbox and come up with kind of just go through and run through the criteria and see how the tools stack up, whether it's the water tool, the fire tool, the agricultural tools. For each of those, to apply the criteria separately. And then the question that I'd challenge the team is, why would someone choose your tool? The Northwest Climate Toolbox has some nice help features on it now, but I don't know that it's quite so clear about why someone would choose your tool over other tools that are out there. And I've just listed 2 tools that are out there, and I'd probably put the CBI tools in this list as well. But for example, there's the Climate Ag, or the Ag Climate Atlas tool that covers the whole U.S. There's the Climate Explorer that is connected with the Climate Resilience Toolkit. So why would someone use the Northwest Climate Toolbox compared to some of these others that are out there? And that's it would be nice to have a consult, I think, with the team to kind of help map out the how you would answer that question, or show the answer to that question to decision makers or information intermediaries that might be considering the tool. The same goes for the Climate Console and the database that CBI has. I think from what I've seen, they do a much more thorough job of explaining what the tool is and where it might fit best for different kinds of decision makers. And I think that that having so many examples of different projects provides a way for people to connect and say that there's a decision maker that looks like me, or a project that looks like mine, and so that the Climate Console or the database might be appropriate for me. And so I don't want to spend too much more time on this. I'll just wrap it up by saying what might the next steps be. And I do want to encourage being able to talk to each one of the teams and to cover some of these questions. And that is, what toolboxes does your decision support tool connect with? Is it something like the climate.gov? Is it the water toolbox? Is it the EcoAdapt? Is it the Sea Grant toolbox, for example? And then what are those frames of access or keywords or metadata that really connect with your tool and your stakeholders? And then does your tool have some training and training components built in? And then is there a community of users that you can describe that are sort of a support network or a set of examples for other decision makers to look at? And then to actually take a look at the tools or components within the tools and see how they stack up against these CLEAN network, or these adapted, the criteria that were adapted from the CLEAN network framework. And then I should, in the next box below, I sort of highlight what are some of the challenges in thinking about trying to improve how tools might rank on this within any of these suitability criteria. And there are a couple of challenges. Is that the teams that are developing the tools, just like we talked about in the last webinar with utility, is that they're developing the tools, but actually the training, the descriptive material that would go along with increasing the suitability of a tool, really the expertise for that comes outside of the team that's putting the tool together to some extent. And so how do we involve the rest of the team, for whether it's the co-production team, or how do we get expertise for the communications? It's not necessarily within the current project description, and it poses some scope creep for the different project teams. And it's typical with any kind of, especially software projects, that the efforts to incorporate all these other elements are not part of the original project formulation. So I think we need to address that a little bit. And with that, I think I will wrap up and open it up for questions and comments. First within the CERC team, and then anybody.
Hey, Holly, this is Katie. Thank you so much for the presentation. There's one easy question to answer, I think, in the questions from others. Just throw it out there. Someone just asking about access to the Hartmann 2016 paper that you mentioned at the beginning of the presentation.
Oh, yeah, I think Megan has that and can send it out.
Yes, if you send me your email in the chat box, I can send you Holly's white paper.
And it's gone through some evolution as over this last year, as as we've gone through these webinars, and I've done the consults with the different CERC teams. So it will evolve over this next year too, kind of as we move forward and try to apply these frameworks that we've talked about in the webinars to each of the team's projects.
Holly, is it something that could be shared widely enough that it would be okay if I just attach it to the email I send out with the link to this webinar? Or would you like people to email you individually?
No, I'm fine. No,
That's
please.
fine. Okay, that sounds
yeah,
great.
I'm happy with it going out. Just the understanding it is a white paper, and it's the same with any of these slide decks for the webinars too. Feel free to send those out.
Okay.
I'll make sure that you have the most up-to-date versions of those.
Okay.
For all 5 that we've done so far.
Perfect.
This is Denise. Holly, this was a great presentation again. And one of the things that I'm interested about was the slide that you had put up about emerging keywords. And it seems like there is an overabundance of tools that are in the keywords. And I would say that that's a lot of what the tools that we have been developing, but it feels like there are a lot of things out there. So I like the idea of making sure that we understand what value our tools add, but it also makes me a little bit nervous that we're not thinking as much about the emerging keywords. Mm-hmm. What kind of tools are we going to need to help our stakeholders understand these kinds of efforts? So do you see toolboxes or toolkits that are having tools to help people think about these topics?
I don't necessarily see the toolkits or whole packages. I see a lot of conversation of people looking for tools. Maybe the CAKE network is probably I'd say has more of these kinds of tools under the emerging keywords than some of the other toolboxes.
Okay, I'll take a look at that CAKE network and see what's going on there. And maybe we can talk more about this at some point.
Yeah, but I would say that that's probably the underserved, but you can see, I think I can see why, is that it's not a climate tool per se, but there's sets of tools that are important for doing climate adaptation.
Right. Right, and I'm just worried about all of our tools going out into this world filled with tools.
Oh, there are so many tools.
I know, and they're sort of fun to build.
Yeah, and with these criteria, and especially in challenging any team to make that value proposition or make a case for their tool compared to other tools, it's not meant as a negative take on their tool or what their project has done so far. It's just that it's really from the decision maker's perspective. How will I know that your tool is the one I need? Because I'm seeing so many tools that look sort of like it.
There's quite a few questions coming in the chat box. I don't know if there's another question from your team or if you want to take one of these questions coming in.
Okay, we can open it up.
Okay. Somebody asked about, Melissa asked, what is the name of the decision support tool for land management that you referenced in the presentation?
Let's see. This one, the Adaptation Workbook. That's just what they call it, the Adaptation Workbook, put out by the NIACS.
Great.
And you can get it, if you just go to it's got the link there, just adaptationworkbook.org. And it doesn't say forest and ag workbook. It just says Adaptation Workbook. So, but it is focused on land management and conservation.
Thank you. Great. I had a couple people asking here about the past CERC webinars that were if they're recorded, and if so, can you tell us where they're available? Those are all recorded and available. The ones through CBI, the previous ones in this series are all available on the website. But I'm thinking now, as that questions come in, that might make sense to also put those links in that email with this recording so people can see the previous series as well. But those are all available on the website. Somebody else asked, John asked, is there a formal definition of CERC project?
So this is Megan. I would refer him and anyone who wants to learn more about CERC to visit our website at pnwcirc.org. That's pnwcirc.org.
And I'll just reference, I put the slide back up that are the 3 guiding questions for this, or for the current phase of CERC related to decision support tools.
And John also asks about, it says, on underserved, is there a need for the novice level and tech suspicious? I'm assuming maybe that means access for folks who are novice level or tech suspicious, or perhaps maybe educational materials for those. I don't know if, John, if you could type any clarifying questions, if you had any comment related to that, Holly.
Oh, I think it's a good point, and that within tools, we often are using the tools, and we think that people are just going to come to our tool, but there are many times where the place that tools get considered either don't have access to the internet, or people want materials to take home or to their office to study more. And so thinking about how you output the results of your tool, and how creating paper reports about your tool and what it produces. So if you're creating your tool has customized outputs, are people just doing screen snapshots, or do you have some mechanism for helping people build a report or take the outputs into a report that can be taken to a meeting rather than having to be shown as a slide presentation or used on the internet? So that's an important point. It also has the interfaces, but that's a different webinar talking about the usability assessment and kind of leading people to different levels. They may start out as very novice users with any kind of tool, and how is it that you design an interface that can lead people to greater understanding of the concepts that you're trying to communicate with your tool.
Great, and John did just provide a little follow-up detail in his question. He says he's especially interested in helping people with privacy concerns and poor access. Small ag is the paradigm, facing a lot of economic pressure and competition for land and water. Thanks.
Yeah. I put some of the small communities in there, some of the kind of more remote rural communities, and then there are definitely, whether it's ranchers or farmers or just some of the land owners that don't want to share information so much. It's an important point. Is how do you let your tool serve people that aren't the most well connected in using some of the technical tools? Yeah, and I think within CERC, the conversation has been that we rely on intermediaries to do that for us, not necessarily connect with those users, but to connect with the people who serve those users. But boy, then that intellectual property restrictions issue really comes up. So.
Thanks, Holly. That was the final question so far from the listeners. I'll keep monitoring, but that was it for these.
And so what will happen is at the we've got our upcoming CERC retreat, and just like with the other webinars, we'll have I know that Eva and Denise are putting together a checklist related to the communication effectiveness of tools, and the style sheets as kind of something we can review. And then I'll be putting together some checklists related to these other evaluation frameworks that we've covered so far in the webinars. So from this webinar, you'll be seeing kind of the checklist with those different criteria, and a checklist about some of those frames of reference or keywords that we can use to talk about either at the retreat or afterwards, to make sure that it really fits what's going on within CERC. And if anybody on the webinar has other criteria that are related to suitability, I'd appreciate hearing from any of you, because it is something that it's just one piece of how tools are evaluated, but it's one that the decision makers really are challenged with, because there are so many tools out there. And as you can see, that each of those toolboxes are using their own frames of reference or own criteria.
All right, well, thank you so much, Holly, Megan, and everyone else who was on today. I'll just open it for any final questions before we go. One last question? Nope. Okay. Well, again, this has all been recorded, and I will upload that and send it around. And thank you so much for joining us today.
All right, everybody have a great week.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you, Holly.